When we feel stuck, it can be hard to picture what's possible in the new year. But sometimes a small change, like refreshing your dinner routine, can make a big difference in your day-to-day. Cook Unity makes it easy to reset your meal habits with a variety of vibrant, healthy meals crafted by award-winning chefs. The chefs you see on TV and in five-star kitchens are the chefs who craft each small batch meal, and they're delivered directly to your door, ready to enjoy. There's no cooking required, and it's way healthier and cheaper than other delivery options. Experience the convenience of dishes made from local, in-season ingredients delivered straight to your door. It's an effortless way to savor high-quality, chef-prepared meals while feeling good about what you eat. Take a step toward a fresh start with Cook Unity, chef-crafted meals designed with you in mind. Go to cookunity.com/podcast or enter code podcast before checkout to get 50% off your first week. That's 50% off your first week at cookunity.com/podcast.
89% of business leaders say AI is a top priority. The right choice is crucial, which is why teams at 1/3 of Fortune 500 companies use Grammarly. Grammarly is the right AI assistant for your team. With top-tier security credentials and 15 years of experience in responsible AI, Grammarly is how companies like yours increase productivity while keeping data protected and private. See why 70,000 teams trust Grammarly at grammarly.com/enterprise.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I am your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. If you like the show, be sure to check out. If you want to get a hold of me, you can reach me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. If you email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure and check out our Patreon, the Opperman Report Patreon. Everything here Monday to Friday on AM/FM radio you could find over there at Patreon with all the ads and the commercials cut out. Plus, it's the best search engine to find old shows. And I think that's where we're going to start doing the live show. Just starting January 1st, the live show I've been doing on Spreaker for the past 10 years or 11 years. Spreaker is taking away our ability to do live broadcasts on there. So I'm going to do the live show through Patreon. Okay, there's a live feed I can put up on there. I haven't figured out the technology there yet, but I will. Hey, we got a whole another 10 days or whatever, 5 days before next year. I'll figure it out. Also, too, you go to Spreaker.com. That's where all the archives are. You can find the old shows. There's a chat room. You get an email notification when I put up new content, and I do play repeats there every single day. Okay, very, very excited about today's show. We have an old guest. He's the Steve Martin of the Opperman Report. Ted Rubinstein is back, and he's brought a friend with him, Steve Kopesky, and they're both experts on the assassination, the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, James R. Hoffa. Some people think it's Earl, but it's James Riddle Hoffa. Okay, just a little known, trivia there. So, Mr. Steve, let's start with Mr. Steve Kopesky. Are you there?
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Steve, for coming on the show. So introduce yourself to the audience. Who is Steve Kopesky?
Oh, well, I guess most people who know me in my life, they know me as being a independent researcher, or I consider myself a parapolitical researcher. I try to carry on the legacy of people like Mae Brussel and Dave Emery and Ed Opperman, and away from that, I've been involved in politics, progressive politics. I'm active in my union at my day job. Guess I'm sort of on the track to be what's called a member organizer. I'm a longtime listener of the Opperman Report. I guess you could say I'm an old school oppermaniac. So this is a real treat. I'm fighting back some of my anxiousness talking to you.
No, you're great, man. And thank you so much for coming on such short notice, too. And speaking of the great Mae Brussels and the great Dave Emery, we have the great Ted Rubinstein on the other line with us. Ted, are you there?
You're too kind. I'm here.
So, Ted, remind the audience, who is Ted Rubinstein?
Well, like Steve, I'm a long-time parapolitical researcher. I've been doing it probably a lot longer than a lot of people were born. Yeah. Before a lot of people were born. Anyway, so I knew Mae Brussel, and I worked with Dave Emery way back in the '70s and '80s, and I also worked on Larry Flint's Rebel magazine, and mainly I've been following the Kennedy assassination and the developments surrounding that for the last 50 years almost that I've been studying it. So I should know everything about it, but it's like the more you study, the more there is to know.
Yeah, I'm going to write a book one day. The more you learn, the less you know. You know. And what about Paul Kraser? Ever do any work with him, Rampart?
No, I didn't. I just knew of his work.
You weren't really a fan of his.
I was not a big admirer of him, just because the first time I ever heard him, it was the stupidity over the Lyndon Johnson thing with JFK, which I won't get into because it's just too stupid and gross. And I just was never that impressed with the guy, but I know he got a big following surrounding his obscure magazine called The Realist.
Realist, I meant, right? Not the Rampart, right? The Realist, yeah.
Yeah,
because the Yippies were big fans.
With Ramparts.
Yeah, the Yippies were big fans of Krasner.
For sure, yeah, he was definitely in the yippie and yipster mold.
Yeah. It's funny too because I was just, and I've had I play the Mae Brussels archives every Sunday morning on the Opera Report Spreaker channel, which goes out to everything. I think it goes out to iHeart and stuff, and YouTube, I think, as well. And also, too, I'm going to talk to Dave Emery. I've had him on the show a couple of times. I'm going to talk to him about playing his archives too, as well. And the last thing we were talking about with Emery was. Well, I was asking him, what do you make of all these new podcasters out there who consider themselves in your legacy and Mae Brussels' legacy and the legacy of someone like Ted Rubinstein, but they fall for the Trump. You know what I mean? They're followers of Trump, making excuses for Trump and MAGA. And he was telling me, he says, "Well, who are they? Give me a list of these people." So I guess they're so obscure he hasn't even heard of them. But Ted, what do you make of that?
Very obscure.
Yeah. What do you make of those characters, Ted?
Some of them are very good, I think. Some of them are very good. I would say, as a rule, I don't really like to listen to them because, first of all, they think they're so amusing. Mm-hmm. They're always bantering back and forth with each other, and I really get turned off by that. And some of them are not that informed on the subjects they're pontificating about. But no, some of them are very good, and I try to follow them. But there's just so many of them.
Yeah,
that's part of the problem.
Absolutely. So now here we are today. We're bringing up a James Riddle Hoffa. So, Mr. Kopesky, why don't you start us out here? Steve Kopesky, why don't you give us a little background on Jimmy Hoffa? Who is Jimmy Hoffa?
Well, James R. Hoffa was most known for being president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters for 14 years, from 1957 to 1971. I should say that one of the things that kind of has kept me interested, it's been about 5 years that I've been on this subsect of deep politics and parapolitics, the life of Jimmy Hoffa. Now, I'm not going to say that I know enough about literary or philosophical archetypes, but I feel like there's a type of guy out there where people think, well, he might be a crook, but he's a crook that's on our side. The one example I could think of as far as contemporary goes would be Donald Trump. But I think there is a stark difference between Jimmy Hoffa and Donald Trump. Number one, Jimmy Hoffa, for all his flaws, and we'll get into them, believe me, he was not propped up by a laundry list of billionaires and ghouls from the Heritage Foundation and Peter Thiel and whatnot. Number two, Jimmy Hoffa was murdered. They had to silence him that way. And I'm not even going to entertain those farcically silly assassination attempts on Trump. To me, they just kind of smack of Nixon-era, Roger Stone-esque dirty tricks. But if you look at Hoffa's life and the things that he said, mostly personally, but also in a lot of speeches he made, he had a very interesting worldview. I think the closest thing I could say today for younger people my age is I'd almost call it like they call it a black pill almost. But he was a guy who started in the labor movement very early in the Depression era in the 1930s. He was mentored initially by a very famous Marxist, very famous Trotskyist, Farrell Dobbs was his name, when he was training to be an organizer for the Teamsters in Minnesota. Farrell Dobbs, some people might recognize his name. There's a series of books from Pathfinder Press written by Dobbs, a lot of them about those experiences. So Hoffa, he's been described as a lifelong Republican, which I think technically he was on paper. Keep in mind, Republicans and Democrats have today versus back then. Anyway.
Yeah, the lines are so blurred now. What the hell's going on?
Well, I would almost add, I'm from Wisconsin. Some people could generously say that progressivism in America was birthed in Wisconsin from the La Follette family, who were Republicans, but hard to imagine today. There used to be liberal and progressive Republicans. Anyway, so Hoffa did come up with
Bob La Follette.
Yeah, Fightin' Bob, and they have the Fightin' Bob festival up there in Madison annually. So Hoffa did have exposure to that Marxist worldview, but at the same time, I think he even says it explicitly in his autobiography, Hoffa, The Real Story, where he says, I've never met a communist that wasn't a screwball. I think that the problems of capitalism can work themselves out. It would appear, though, that privately he didn't think that they could work themselves out. He said enough that where he basically had expressed that he accepted that liberal reforms that some of his contemporaries, like Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers Union, another Detroit guy, he saw those types of liberal and progressive reforms as just kind of superficial and just kind of a Band-Aid on a lot of problems. Hoffa identified that the contradictions of capitalism were not going to resolve themselves, but he also knew that he himself benefited from capitalism. So I guess the way he saw it, and I'm not the only one that thinks this, was that he was going to pick the winning side, which he viewed as capitalism. And I've read so much about him. Sometimes I feel like I know him on some level. I do get the strong impression, and I stand by this, that he thought, I'm going to pick the winning side, capitalism, and when the contradictions of the free market system really come to a head, which they really were up until the time of his disappearance / murder in the 1975. This was right on the dawn of the horizon of the what you call the neoliberal revolution was just starting. All those reforms were about to start getting rolled out under Carter and Reagan later. So I think he saw himself as this figure that he was going to use capitalism to be a new leader, if that makes sense.
And I guess he was thinking, well, capitalism inevitably will fail.
He does. I mean, he never said this out loud, black and white. But I think, like I said, I think he saw himself as someone who would be the logical leader for when the contradictions were heightened enough.
Well, then what do you make of the allegations of organized crime, corruption?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know if those are even allegations. I mean, they're pretty much...
Well, there's no such thing. What?
Well, yes, that's true. He actually did say that one of his more explosive interviews would be one of the last ones he gave, which was in Playboy magazine, where he actually did repeat that J. Edgar Hoover line. He said there is no mafia, but then a few sentences later, the interviewer asked him, "Oh, do you know Frank Costello? Do you know Meyer Lansky?" And he just casually says, "Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Yeah."
Yeah, that was the party line growing up when I was a kid too. There is no such thing as mafia. Growing up on Staten Island,
something I did, something I wanted to touch on. I don't know when we, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, because you would know this probably more intimately than I do. This is just stuff I read and ask about. I think a lot of the portrayals of organized crime in America tend to come from that kind of unique subsect of the New York, New Jersey, the portrayals we're used to seeing in The Godfather and Goodfellas and The Sopranos, where it's kind of like a military-like structure with the bosses and the underbosses and the capos and the soldiers. And Ted, also feel free to chime in with this. I get the impression, just from my research, actually a book came to my attention, which is very good, and I recommend you get a hold of it, called Payoff by a Ramparts writer, Michael Dorman, where he pretty much lays out large parts of America, even small cities that people have never heard of, like Reading, Pennsylvania, was completely dominated in its local government by organized crime. A more explicit example of that would be a place people have forgotten about called Phoenix City, Arkansas, which was...
No, wait. Phoenix City is Alabama.
Oh, sorry, Alabama. Thank you. That was same as Reading, Pennsylvania. It was just completely dominated by organized crime, and I guess the National Guard had to get sent in, basically.
Yeah, not just organized crime, too. When I was interviewing the family of the company, Fuzzy Thorpe, they had control of the sheriffs of all these little towns, man. They were paying everybody off.
Oh, shit. Oh, well, the law enforcement, that goes without saying. Yeah, absolutely.
And the mayor, assemblyman, like
absolutely.
judges,
Yeah, definitely. But saying that, to go back to what you've said first, a quote that actually isn't Hoffa's, it belongs to later disgraced Teamsters boss Roy Lee Williams. He said it best when he said the mafia was there before I got here, and they're going to be here after I got here. So that's that.
So Ted, what do you make?
Quote? It's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
But Ted, I was going to ask you, what do you make of Steve's portrayal of Hoffa as sort of like a? Where do you see his political leanings stand?
Well, I must say I'm learning quite a bit here because I wasn't that familiar with his political leanings in terms of the way he viewed communism and capitalism.
Well, on a practical side or publicly, I mean, he was definitely opportunist. I mean, they definitely spread money and influence to both parties. So, I mean.
Now, it's would you call Farrell Dobbs a Trotskyist?
Yeah.
Okay, because he seems to be sort of influenced by Trotskyism, as I heard you discuss it. It's very, very interesting.
I think a lot of the Trotskyists of that era, I think they were responding to the information that was coming out about the Soviet Union under Stalin. So I think it was a way to kind of differentiate yourself from that.
So what do you guys make of the rise of Hoffa and then ultimately the fall of Hoffa?
So I'll say this real quick. When I first started researching Jimmy, I guess it was about almost 5 years ago now. I think I had kind of at first like a superficial interest. A lot of the stuff, it just seems right out of a James Ellroy novel. As a matter of fact, a lot of that is fictionalized in a couple of James Ellroy's books of these real events. It was actually only very recently, which is odd considering my background in my own union and other unions, I did start to see this more as a story of labor versus capital. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take such a heavy-handed approach right off the bat here, ideologically. But I did kind of start to see this as more of a labor versus capital or labor versus the establishment, maybe to put it more precisely. Jimmy is born in a coal mining town called Brazil, Indiana. His father was a coal miner. He dies of what they never really actually wrote down a cause of death, but I think it's widely accepted that it had something to do with working down in the coal mines. Him and his mother and his siblings, they moved to Detroit right at the beginning of the Great Depression. Jimmy drops out of school by the 6th grade, not uncommon back then, and he gets his start where his story really starts. It's really pretty organic. He's working at a loading dock for Kroger's. It's a grocery store chain, still around. And the conditions for workers in that era were really quite Dickensian. I think the standard work week was 48 hours, and what Hoffa describes in multiple is he has about what you would call two autobiographies. The story that he says about working on this loading dock was lots of people would show up for work, and they'd pick a handful to go work on the loading dock, unloading mostly food, perishable items. And you could stand outside all day, and you only really just get paid for what you work. The conditions were just bad enough that it inspired the young Hoffa to start talking with people and get some retribution, particularly for this foreman. And even when he talks about this, you kind of see this real cynical attitudes towards the employment class, and particularly this foreman that he talks about specifically. So his crew, they decide to make their first move when a large shipment of strawberries comes to the loading docks, and they decide that they're going to use the strawberries as the leverage. They say, we're not going to unload these, and since it's fresh fruit, they're going to go bad if they aren't refrigerated properly. And it actually is successful, and that little clique of guys, they would go down in Hoffa legacy. It's called the Strawberry Boys, or the Strawberry Gang. And that's kind of what brings him to the attention of the very small but growing Original Teamsters Union. It had a much longer name, International Brotherhood of Teamsters and Chauffeurs of Service Men of America. That would take him up through the going out to Minnesota and being under the tutelage of Farrell Dobbs, and then coming back to Detroit, which I guess would be the start of we would call his early forays into his alliances with organized crime. Ted, you got anything?
No, it's all very interesting to me, because you've studied Hoffa's life a lot more in depth than I have.
You know what I find interesting, because off the air we were talking about Fist and the Robert Blake Jimmy Hoffa movie, but way back to On the Waterfront. They all have that scene where they're out there, all the workers are out there trying to shouldering each other to get that out in front, to get that 5 jobs out for 100 guys out there waiting. They've all got that scene.
Yeah, that was not uncommon. Yeah. Tangentially related, I believe, On the Waterfront, that the gangster character is based on Johnny Dio, who someone will talk about coming up here. And anyway, so the first real interesting thing it's a little bit debated on what exactly his first alliance with organized crime is. Some have pointed to it being a young Mo Dalitz when he was affiliated with the Purple Gang in Detroit. He would come back later. One of the angles that I actually find the most interesting was a old school Sicilian gangster. He was a really pretty terrifying guy when you read about him. There's not a whole lot of information out there beyond a couple articles. A guy named Frankie Coppola, a.k.a. Frankie Three Fingers Coppola. Interestingly enough, there's another gangster with the nickname Three Fingers who shows up later in the saga. But Frankie Coppola is a very fascinating character. He's almost like a super gangster almost. He's involved in narcotics trafficking. Obviously, he's affiliated with Santo Traficante and narcotics trafficking through Cuba. He's implicated in white slavery in Mexico, along with all the things that you'd expect: labor racketeering, extortion, gambling. Frankie Coppola kind of comes into Hoffa's orbit as one of an early girlfriend of Hoffa's, which it stands out because, believe it or not, Hoffa was a really pretty straight and narrow guy in his personal life. I think that kind of fed into his desire to kind of be the resolve of the contradictions in the system. Was that he was constant. He didn't drink alcohol, he didn't smoke, he didn't gamble, he didn't womanize. He was really into working out and taking care of himself, which these sounds like positives, but at the end of the day, they kind of almost end up being negatives for a guy like Hoffa. This means that there's no way to really control him through things like gambling or women. Anyway, so an early girlfriend of Hoffa's before he meets his wife is a woman called Sylvia Pagano, and she had been she'll show up more prominently throughout Hoffa's life, but she was also a girlfriend of this guy, Frankie Coppola. Now, the real interesting thing about Coppola is he seems to be mixed up in a lot of other really interesting things, particularly in people. I'm sure Opperman Report listeners are familiar with Operation Gladio and the strategy of tension, a real kind of an early part of that. Well, maybe not even an early part. Well, something leading up to Operation Gladio would be the fixing of the Italian elections in 1948. Probably one of the best accounts of this is in a book called Killing Hope by William Bloom. The CIA was dumping a lot of money into making sure that the Italians did not vote for the Communist Party, which, as far as I can tell at this time, Italy had probably the strongest Communist Party outside of the Soviet Union. Coppola, and what I've seen described in two different places, one being Operation Gladio by Paul L. Williams, was described as a friend of Angleton, James Jesus Angleton, who was sent back over to Rome to basically form like goon squads or death squads to help make sure that people didn't vote communist.
Did I lose you?
No, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So many audio problems. You got to be on your toes, you know?
Sorry about that. Ted, you know a little bit about Coppola, right?
I didn't know that he had any connection to, I guess, what are you calling the antecedents of Operation Gladio?
Yeah, that's kind of how I've always interpreted it.
I knew that he was one of the people that was involved with the Allies' utilization of hoodlum elements to guard against communist activity and to alert the authorities of stuff like that.
Hey, what do you make of that? You hear these theories about people saying that Operation Gladio extended into the Red Army faction and the Baader-Meinhof gang.
I mean, I've always interpreted it as that. Yeah.
Really?
Well, I think
there
I
are
could
elements of law enforcement infiltrating those organizations, and so it's not surprising at all that the right would utilize the left for false flag operations, which is what people suspected was going on with the Red Brigades, especially.
Yeah.
I don't know so much about Baader-Meinhof, how infiltrated they were and manipulated, but certainly could be. I haven't really studied the Red Brigades or the Baader-Meinhof at any.
And it's very difficult to because there's very little material on it in the U.S. There's hardly anything on these podcasts or YouTube or anything like that. Nothing.
Well, yeah, all that stuff it precedes the internet.
Yeah, well, sure.
So you have to go to books for that. For sure.
Well, there's really only a handful of books out there, and
right.
And honestly, one of them is kind of pulpy and kind of a little difficult to accept. It wraps things up a little too nicely. But I always interpreted Gladio to have kind of a lot of tentacles, as a lot of different countries in Europe kind of had their version of it. There's a lot of pretty nasty things happening in Sweden and former Czechoslovakia. I mean, all over Europe, really. The author Stieg Larsson, who's most famous for the books, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and that whole series. They made him into some movies. He actually was a pretty committed anti-fascist researcher. He did a lot of work on that. But again, not a lot of it in English, so not super accessible to us over here.
Right, and I had a guest on once, and he didn't even want to talk about it. It was that guy. He wrote one of those books, and he didn't even want to talk about it. He was that guy he was a professor, and he got in trouble saying that 9/11 was like a Native American activist. You know who I'm talking about?
I think that was the guy who I said wrote the pulpier book about it.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Did you say it was Fetzer?
No. I have
okay.
Fetzer.
I misheard you.
I think the company line on Gladio here in America is that the information that we get is based on a disinformation from the Soviet Union. Go figure.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to Hoffa.
Yeah, sorry.
Mr. Hoffa. No. I'm the one that derailed us into the Red Army faction. I would love to do some shows on that, you know?
Keep that in mind.
There's nobody out there. Now we got Steve Kopesky.
No.
Well, what about this guy Paul Williams that Steve just mentioned?
He's got an interesting resume. I'll just say that.
See what I mean?
He's popular in like apocalyptic Christianity circles.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Jimmy. So we've established that he makes these associations with organized crime pretty early, whether it's with Mo Dallas or if it's with this guy, Frankie Coppola, who he shared a girlfriend with, Sylvia Pagano. And like I said, Sylvia Pagano would remain a fixture in Hoffa's life. She has a son named Chucky O'Brien, who is a very important figure throughout going up right up into the end of Hoffa's life. Anyway, so he has these alliances with the gangsters. Now, what a lot of people probably don't quite realize is organized crime does have the stereotype of constantly being in bed with organized labor, but they were also equally, especially at this time in the Depression, they were also just as much on the side as the employers were. And a lot of times, employers hired the gangsters to beat up the strikers and the workers and to intimidate the workers. So really, this kind of comes down to a both sides are guilty, situation. So yeah, that brings us to that. Any other questions so far?
No. Ted?
No.
Cool, very good. All right, so Hoffa is rising through the ranks, and I'll fast forward a little bit into the Dave Beck, who is the international president of the Brotherhood of Teamsters, who is he's a kind of basically a corrupt guy. He's a Teamster out of Seattle, and about this, we'll just skip to the McClellan Committee. Now, the McClellan Committee is chaired. This is where Bobby Kennedy enters the picture. Now, I spent a lot of the last few years kind of taking a neutral position on both Bobby Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa. Probably a little too neutral. I think I was kind of missing a big point, which I'll make here. Now, the McClellan Committee, and this is where you can find a lot of footage of Bobby and Jimmy fighting it out in the courtroom. A lot of it, you can find recordings of it. So the people who are on the church committee, not church, I'm sorry, it's the full name is the United States Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management. So it was specifically going after corruption and organized labor. Now, the Democrats on the committee are McClellan, the namesake, John F. Kennedy, JFK, Sam Ervin, who would later go on to be the Watergate counsel, and Patrick McNamara, not much there. But then the last Democrat is Frank Church, who would go on to chair the Church Committee in the 70s.
Now, that I wasn't even aware of, that Frank Church was on the McClellan Committee.
I mean,
well, one thing for good and bad, the RFK Jimmy Hoffa feud kind of overpowers a lot of its legacy. Now, the interesting thing about let's look at the minority members on the committee. This, by that I mean the Republicans, and the three names that stand out are Carl Munt from South Dakota, Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, and Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Carl Munt, he's kind of I would say a standard reactionary maniac, not uncommon for that time. Joe McCarthy, I don't know, do we need much more information?
Yeah, the gang's all here.
Yeah, pretty much. Just as a side note, if anybody's curious, well, maybe they're too depressed to be curious, but if anybody's curious about how we got to where we are today, an excellent book I always recommend by a writer named Fred J. Cook, who will play into the Jimmy Hoffa saga a little later, wrote a book called The Nightmare Decade, which is ostensibly about Joe McCarthy, but It chronicles the immediate backlash of opposition to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. It's all there in that book, so I do recommend that book to people. Anyway, and Barry Goldwater, the third guy on the McClellan Committee, Barry Goldwater, most people know he's was considered much too radical for the Republicans in 1964 when he ran against Lyndon Johnson. But I think the quote that says it all about Goldwater is when he won the 1964 nomination to run against Johnson, one of his delegates was quoted as saying, "We just moved the Mason-Dixon line up to Canada." So I think that says it all about the Republican Party going forward. That and the leaked quote from Lee Atwater, if people are familiar with that. If not, I recommend you checking it out. I think that says everything about their agenda. Anyway, so sorry, that was a long way of saying that we got some pretty hard right and pretty anti-labor forces on the McClellan Committee. One of the big, I'll fast forward a little bit, the first big case, or the first big public case, gets pretty interesting and pretty deep into some weird politics. Bobby Kennedy would go on to start what was basically called the Get Hoffa Squad, but leading up to that, a very interesting person enters the picture, a guy by the name of John C. Chiesti. Ted, you're familiar with this, aren't you?
I'm barely familiar with this guy, Chiesti.
Oh, okay. So he pops up, and according to the story, Jimmy Hoffa approaches him. He's under the impression that he's a New York lawyer. And he says, "I could use you to go be a spy for me on the McClellan Committee to see what's going on." Now, the story is that Chiesti agrees, but he's so offended by the blatant criminality portrayed by Mr. Hoffa that he immediately goes to Bobby Kennedy and tells him exactly what happened, and they make an agreement that he's going to be a double agent. He's going to act like he's spying for Hoffa, but he, in fact, is going to be spying for Bobby Kennedy in his camp. Real quick, I would like to say, I'm going to sound like I'm really bashing Bobby Kennedy. Unfortunately, I think the truth with this is there's just really not a really good and a really bad guy, really. Everybody kind of acts badly. I think I would say I am an admirer of RFK, probably more so towards his presidential run when he was genuinely interested in alleviating poverty and ending the war. But at this point in his life, especially before his brother's assassination, he's not going to look so good. Anyway, so Bobby... So Bobby starts to kind of leak stuff to Chiesti to give to Hoffa, stuff that's serious enough that lets Hoffa think that he's got a genuine, spy in Bobby's camp, but nothing so big that it's going to, derail anything. Now, an arrangement is made that there's going to be a payoff. Hoffa offers him, I want to say, it was either $12,000 or $20,000. I can't remember. I'm sorry, right off at this moment. But there's going to be a handoff, and this is all actually documented on film. There is footage you can go find on the internet of Hoffa wearing a trench coat outside a hotel in D.C., and there was a handoff made of the money for documents between Chiesti and Hoffa. And this is like the first bust that Bobby gets with Jimmy, because during the McClellan Committee, Hoffa... I mean, he's always able to stay in this kind of gray area as far as legality and criminality. Now, like I said, they portrayed Chiesti as just an honest lawyer who just wanted to do the right thing. Now, I'm going to draw people's attention to his New York Times obituary. John C. Chiesti, star witness in Teamsters case, dies at 96. He died when he was 96 years old. They describe him as the star witness after James R. Hoffa of the Teamsters Union recruited him to spy on the Senate committee investigating labor racketeering. Now, what nobody really mentions, but it's right here in his in his obituary, Mr. Chiesti began his career as a Treasury agent in the 1930s after graduating from Manhattan College and Fordham Law. He worked with the Treasury team that built a tax evasion case against Enoch Nucky Johnson, the Republican boss of Atlantic City, New Jersey. That's Steve Buscemi's character in the show Boardwalk Empire, if you've ever seen that.
Yep.
As a Navy commander in World War II, he's in charge of a base in the Philippines. Back home in Brooklyn, after realizing he back home in Brooklyn, he handles the tax evasion cases for Joe Bassano, nephew of Albert Anastasia. At the very end of the obituary, it says that in the 60s and 70s, he told members of his family that he was a contract agent for the Central Intelligence Agency. I don't know. This doesn't really sound just like an honest lawyer just out to do the right thing to me. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Did he do divorces?
Good question.
Go ahead, Ted.
Did this didn't come out when he was alive that he was a contract agent with the CIA?
No, but even without that, he seemed. I was initially under the impression that he was somebody that came out of the some of the shadows of the Lansky syndicate. But the impression I'm trying to give here is that I think he was not a. He was someone in a unique position that Bobby Kennedy. I think he might have been inserted into Hoffa's life. Now,
do you think Robert Kennedy knew that he was a CIA contract agent?
Well, that's hard to say because there's really not a lot of information about that.
That's fascinating, though.
Yeah,
it makes me want to find out more information about this guy.
Ted, that wasn't in the Hoffa Wars, which is one of the more seminal books on the Jimmy. We'll talk about that more later, I presume. So now we're going to get into kind of the meat of what people remember from this era. And I'm actually going to read a little bit, if you don't mind, from a book that everybody listening to the Opperman Report should own and should have read, Spooks, The Haunting of America, The Private Use of Secret Agents by Jim Hogan.
Well, how many people in the Opperman's audience do you think have read this book or are going to read the book?
They really need to.
No, believe it or not, Ted, my audience definitely buys books.
Classic.
My audience buys books like crazy.
They should be familiar.
Probably out of print, but definitely worth hunting for and worth paying for.
Oh, they got a new edition. They got a new paperback. Anyway.
Cool.
So this is in the context of John Saichiste setting up Hoffa, getting the payoff for the documents. It was only the first in a series of indictments brought against Hoffa by Kennedy, who in later years would use his power as Attorney General to have upward of 40 grand juries working simultaneously to indict the labor leader and his associates. Besides the grand juries, he would also bring to bear the combined forces of the FBI, the IRS, and a consortium of Justice Department strike forces. There would be, in addition to a coordinated anti-Hoffa campaign in the press, an elite unit of investigator spooks, intelligence community veteran led by Walter Sheridan. All of these forces would be targeted against the Teamsters. It was no wonder then that Hoffa was eventually indicted on a panoply of charges ranging from bribery to wiretapping, profiteering to perjury. The evidence unearthed in these investigations makes it clear that Hoffa was an unethical man, a ruthless wheeler-dealer who used his union's pension fund for his own financial gain, making alliances with petty criminals and in some cases negotiating sweetheart contracts for his private advantage. This is me speaking. Yes, that's all true. Back to the text. What the evidence does not make clear, however, is that many of the crimes allegedly committed by Hoffa, bribery, wiretapping, and even perjury, were defensive responses to the ruthlessness of Robert Kennedy and his legions of ambitious investigators and government attorneys. Indeed, it almost seems as if Kennedy's unrelenting pressure caused Hoffa to change from the mildly corrupt labor leader that he was in the early 50s to an authentic villain he eventually became. Virtually at war with the United States government and betrayed on every front, Hoffa's survival dictated that he responded in kind. There was a degree of scrutiny that no one can survive, no matter how ethical and honest he might be. Now, that was all a very long-winded way of saying, I think it's, and this is something that people don't really bring up when they do talk about Hoffa. There was an explosion of interest of him slightly after the Netflix movie The Irishman came out. And even then, in the wake of that, if you read things like Jacobin magazine, which is a pretty well-to-the-left magazine, which on average I don't disagree with a lot of the stuff I read in Jacobin, but they really like to write stuff like Jimmy Hoffa was no hero. Jimmy Hoffa is not someone we should miss. I would actually make the argument, because in that passage from Spooks that I just read kind of heightens what I meant when I was talking about the hard right anti-labor people on the McClellan Committee. I think they were the driving forces behind a lot of this. Bobby Kennedy himself was a much more staunch anti-communist at the time. There was a lot of paranoia about communist and socialist influence on the labor unions, especially at that time. One could even make the argument that after different waves of different Red Scares, they had purged all the unions of pretty much any committed leftist or socialist who was genuinely interested in in honest labor. That pretty much all that was left was the gangster element.
And that gangster element also had CIA connections and all kinds of ties. Sometimes it was the same bunch, you know?
Oh, that goes without saying.
Yeah, Frank Fiorini.
Yeah.
And also, too, it seems like, too, that the response of any socialist movement when you're coming under attack by the infiltration of CIA is to repression of your own people and hunkering down, you know, like in Cuba or Venezuela, to hunker down, you know, under the attack. You know, I guess the Hoffa reacted the same way, which is textbook.
Yeah, which I really hate to say that I think I've developed a more pro-Hoffa stance on this. Like I said, I tried to be as neutral as I could over this period of time, but when I finally looked at it from an anti-labor stance, I did think, there are some pretty messed up dudes on the McClellan Committee, and Bobby Kennedy was really doing a number around the Constitution, which we'll get to a little later. Ted, what are you thinking?
No, I agree with you.
I have a quick question before Ted. Now, what about these Teamster loans? Everybody hears about these loans, organized crime to the casinos. Were the Teamsters being harmed by those loans? Were those loans paid back? Were they defaulted on?
No. Well, throughout its histories, one loan was defaulted on. We can talk more about that one because it turns into one of the third or fourth trial that Hoffa ends up getting busted for. But no, actually, Ed, I know you're a former Vegas guy. It's no secret that the mob in the Teamsters pension fund built a lot of Las Vegas. One of an early guy that Sarno was his first name or last name. Ted, you know who I'm talking about?
Jay Sarno?
Yes, that was it. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't have that written down. Jay Sarno. He had gotten a lot of money for Caesar's Palace, Circus. You just name all the ones. The Dunes. That was a famous. Yeah, they all got money from the pension fund, and those were successful examples. Actually, funny enough, through modalities, it wasn't even just, and this would kind of, show just how much part of American infrastructure a guy like Jimmy Hoffa was. Another reason, he would end up being so dangerous to the establishment was he was a lot of some early loans that Dalits got through him was building highways. I think they built some hospital with a member of the Adelson family. That's interesting. So, Sorry, that was a rambling answer to a simple question.
No, not at all. That's very
so those loans were in fact paid back?
As far as I know, I mean, the biggest one that I can think of, just looking through my notes here, it would be the infamous Sun Valley loan, which so at this point, I mean, we're getting right up to about the Kennedy assassination. Is there any directions we want to go in starting here?
Well, just keep in mind, we've only got about 13 minutes left, so we're going to have to do a part two. Do you guys want to do that part two? No, I'm serious. Do you want to do that part two today, or do you want to reschedule for another day?
Well, I will have to reschedule. I am sorry, but
okay,
I would love to.
Okay. And Ted, you'll be available if we give you a couple of days' notice?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm usually available.
Yeah, just not for me. Okay. Okay, so take it to the next step here, Mr. Kopesky.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll finish up with some of these first trials. So, actually, I didn't even finish up the John Saichisti episode. So Hoffa's busted with I feel comfortable calling it kind of a setup with that possible spook lawyer. That's and the interesting thing about this episode is when it goes to trial, it's in Washington D.C. and it's primarily a black jury. A move that Jimmy would make, and he ends up the case. He ends up beating the case. It's actually pretty easy for him. He has access to a lot of pretty good lawyers, one of them being a guy named Edward Bennett Williams, which people should be familiar with. His biography called The Man to See. I think that phrase actually sums him up. I think he would have been one of the men to see if you were in positions like Hoffa. So this primarily black jury for the this handoff sting that Jimmy gets busted in. An interesting appearance is made by the boxer Joe Louis, who kind of casually shows up to the courtroom and comes up and shakes hands with Jimmy. Now, this was obviously going to be really pretty impressive to the jury. Walter Sheridan, when asked about how he felt about losing this case, he made it sound kind of bad. He made it sound like, well, it was a bunch of black people, so yeah, that's why. So it doesn't look good for Sheridan.
Didn't Joe Louis go on to become a greeter in Las Vegas?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, ironically on this, though, it does. They tried to portray it that Joe Louis was just an old friend back from Detroit who knew Jimmy Hoffa socially and knew him pretty well. It would come out later. Sheridan and another guy who will come up later, Carmine Bellino, another prominent member of the Get Hoffa squad. They would start to look at some receipts, and they would find that Joe Louis was, in fact, on a Teamsters payroll.
To do what?
Who was on the who did you say was on the Teamster payroll?
Joe Louis.
Joe Louis.
Oh,
I think it was listed as a. Well, I don't think it was a real job. I think public relations, something like that.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised that he was rewarded for the courtroom stunt.
Well, Hoffa and RFK, they had met right before this, actually before this whole, before the John Saichiste and Joe Louis episode.
Well, I'm not familiar with the courtroom stunt. What was that?
Oh, with the Joe Louis showing up?
No, for Hoffa.
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
They had actually met.
The jury saw that.
Kind of like how Chuck Zito showed up for Trump.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing I could think of is today if a jury was predominantly young women and Taylor Swift showed up to, shake Jimmy's hand or something. I don't know. But anyway, Hoffa and Bobby would actually really only meet face-to-face once, and it was actually before this trial. I should have mentioned this part first. Through a Teamsters lawyer and a Teamsters public relations guy named Eddie Chaffetz. He recommended that Bobby and Jimmy meet, and they did meet for dinner at Chaffetz's house. Hoffa and RFK really did not like each other, and I've read accounts from both of them, both in Hoffa's autobiographies as well as I don't think it was in Bobby's book, The Enemy Within, but there was I've read so many accounts of it, and it's pretty blatantly obvious that both of them were under the impression that they were correct. Both of them were under the impression that they could do the most push-ups. They get into a push-up contest at one point in public, and that dinner at Chaffetz's house was really weirdly interrupted by a call from Ethel Kennedy calling him back home because a driver had crashed into their front porch or something odd, especially for a guy like Bobby Kennedy. Anyway, but that was kind of like their first and only real meeting outside of the courtrooms.
Wait a minute. Well, what about the time that Hoffa almost choked Bobby Kennedy to death in the office or something?
That was after he was arrested for the with the exchange of documents for cash.
Yes. So I thought you said that they only had one meeting.
Well, outside of like courtrooms, and I guess I should have preferenced that socially.
See. Okay. All right. Okay. Got you.
But yes, that day that Hoffa got busted, and he was, and like I said, you can find the footage online. It's primitive, but of Hoffa doing this handoff to Cheesty with the money for the documents. Yeah, when that night when he's in they have him in at the police station. Ethel Kennedy's there, and I want to say Ethel. I think she was like making provoking comments. Yeah, that's where they get into the push-up contest in front of everybody.
And who was this push-up contest between again?
Bobby and Jimmy.
Hoffa and RFK.
Yeah, I hate to point this out because it seems so trivial, but they really both made a big deal about who was like more physically fit.
I could see that. Those are the days.
There's a little of that going on with RFK Jr.
Yeah.
Oh, I saw those Instagram posts. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's all steroids and stuff and testosterone. They didn't have it back in those days.
Well, they did, but not. I don't think guys like him would have been using it. Yeah.
It wasn't readily available. So then what would be the next chapter then? We got about 7 minutes left. What would be the next chapter? So into the assassination?
Yeah, I mean, we could start with that. That actually happens. There's about 5 trials between the Get Hoffa squad and Bobby Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa. And one of them happens, and the Kennedy assassination happens in the middle, basically, of, I think, maybe the 3rd or 4th trial down in Tennessee.
Interestingly enough, the New York Times was doing a big expose of the Teamsters Union in several parts that was just being featured at the time of the assassination.
Well, at this time, I mean, a lot of the media wasn't particularly pro-Hoffa.
No.
But I guess
a lot of the information that the New York Times was publishing at the time was no doubt leaked from Robert Kennedy and his allies.
That's true, and one thing I in general, I try not to be the type of guy that I'll cite a police report when it benefits me, but then I'll say like, oh, you can't trust this when it doesn't benefit me. Hey, actually, I'll do a shout out to an old episode of the Opperman Report where you had a guest named Robert Damon Schneck, the historian of the strange, and on the show.
Yeah.
He seemed like he sounded like a sweet guy. It's too bad that the movie they made based on his book wasn't very good. But he said something on that episode.
About?
Oh, don't worry about it.
The Discordian guy, right?
I don't think it was a Discord. Well, either way, he made a comment that really I try to keep in mind, and I would encourage everybody to keep this in mind. Besides reading this book called How to Be a Successful Private Investigator by Ed Opperman, keep this quote in mind where he says, to be a really good researcher and investigator, you have to acknowledge that your grandparents have a sex life, which I always interpreted as, you need to be you need to be ready to read things that you don't like and that you don't agree with or don't want to acknowledge.
I think he also said during that interview, interesting people meet interesting people.
Well, that's true also. Since we're coming to the end, I mean, one of the big things to try to keep in mind with all of this is, especially in a story like this that we're going to keep unpacking, interesting people and interesting people. I mean, in a situation like this, everybody is kind of a criminal. Everybody's kind of either a criminal or a gangster or a murderer or a CIA asset and a spook. So it's I think that's probably why I flip-flopped on whose side I take more.
No, I hear you, and I've always had the ability to overlook that. You know what I mean? Just to take everybody as they come. And they could be, if they're lying to me, I got a problem with that. But otherwise, whatever their motives are, just you take that with a grain of salt, and you take the information and just throw it out there.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So, Ted, we got 4 minutes left. What do you want to leave us with there, bro?
Well, I don't know. It's just I feel that we're so remiss if we talk about Hoffa and we don't talk about the circumstances of his death. Which is sort of part of American folklore almost now.
Well, absolutely. Well, give us a teaser into that, because I definitely want to do a part 2 of this interview.
Okay, here's a good teaser. In June of 1961, in New Jersey, at a Teamsters Local 560, or 580, I'm sorry, 580 or 560. It's run by a guy named Tony Provenzano. Tony Pro.
It was 560.
It's actually 560. Thank you, Ted. It's actually run by kind of his entire family. Tony, Sal, Nunzio. I think there's a Gabriel in there also. And the Tony Pro, he rules over that local with an iron fist, and he's truly a very dark and very menacing character. He's a capo regime in the Genovese crime family. One thing that I discovered, which is really very dark, was since he was also secretary treasurer of that Teamsters local. One of the common schemes that a lot of the gangster element in the Teamsters would do was called labor leasing, which was basically cutting a deal with the employer and basically paying the union member very little to nothing, definitely below union scale. And if Tony Pro had a loan shark customer or somebody that owed him a debt, what he would do is he would basically lease out the guy to one of the companies, usually a trucking company, but basically work for free. So he basically was selling dudes into slavery, I guess you could make the argument. Now, like I said, Tony Pro really ruled that local with a lot of intimidation. One of his killers is a guy named Sal Bergoglio, and another killer is a guy named Harold Koningsberg. They called him KO. Tony Pro really was not a fan of people opposing him, needless to say. And a gentleman by the name of Anthony Castellito, who's also had the nickname Three Fingers. He also had 3 fingers, just like the Frankie Coppola we mentioned earlier. Castellito decided to run against Tony Pro on a reform ticket. They were calling it the Green Ticket, not having anything to do with the Green Party or anything like that. Now, Castellito was told that he was going to go for a meeting. He was drawn to his summer house in upstate New York, where he, from what we deduce now, he was the papers and stuff. They just acknowledged that Castellito disappeared, but what would come out later was that he was lured to his summer house. Sal Bergoglio jumps him and cracks him over the head with a blackjack. If people remember that old weapon, and basically he was fed through a tree shredder, making the body almost impossible to find, and they never did find the body. So I think that's actually I'll just leave it at that. That's a good teaser for
That's pretty dark.
Body shredder, tree shredder, and blackjacks is always a good way to end a story rather than begin a story. So, guys, we'll schedule a recap of this. We'll get the old crew back together here next week sometime. Okay, I'm available the whole week at this point right now. Although I'm trying to get Hunter Biden's ex-girlfriend there, that stripper in London, to come on the show.
I thought you were going to say you're trying to get Hunter Biden, and I'd be like, whoa.
You'd be surprised, bro. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be a good get.
Well, you guys will be surprised what goes on around behind the scenes over here. We've just enjoyed our show here with Steve Kopesky and the great Ted Rubinstein. We'll have them back to part 2 of Jimmy Hoffa, the death and the post-Hoffa era, and all that kind of stuff at the next week when we return. Same bat time, same bat channel. Guys, thank you so much.
Yeah, I had a blast.
You're quite welcome.
Good night, friends.
I enjoyed it.